Good morning. This is Shane Starr with Reflections on Religion in a parking lot in Newport Beach, waiting for church to start. I realize since I work today, I'll probably have more time right now to do this video than I will later today. So let's get started. Last week we talked about atheism and had a few interesting comments that I responded to concerning atheism as a faith. And you already know the story about belief or faith as a faith. That almost speaks for itself. But I believe atheism is every bit and more a faith than theism is. But what about agnosticism? One would think that in the absence of absolute proof, agnosticism makes the most sense. And I think on the surface, I would agree on the surface. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I understand why agnosticism can be attractive. And oftentimes when we see debates between theists and atheists, agnosticism seems like the most reasonable alternative. I think the more I examine this position, though, the more issues I see with it, and that's what this video is going to be about. So I would say where would be the best place to start? There is a philosopher, one of my favorite that I studied under in my philosophy program at USC, and that is William James. He wrote a couple of books, The Varieties of Religious Experience, and another one called The Will to Believe. And I think to this day, it remains one of the best explanations of agnosticism that I think are out there. And what he does is he compares religious belief or lack thereof to having a ticket to board a ship or a plane, and you're not sure if you want to go or not, so you don't make up your mind. And in his view, and I'm trying to remember if he said ship or plane, I don't know if they had planes that early. I mean, they did, but if they had airlines that early. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is that if you book a flight now in 2026 and you're not sure if you want to go, you can hesitate forever, but eventually the moment of truth, the moment of decision happens, and you're left with either you went or you didn't go. And I guess what I'm trying to say is agnosticism feels completely neutral, but in practice it's passive atheism. It's just a form of sort of neutral unbelief. You know, I've heard this saying attributed to John Lennon and also Bob Dylan. I'm not sure where it came from, but the quote is, "Life is what happens when we're making other plans." And that's the idea, my idea behind agnosticism. I think, we can suspend belief, but in the meantime, we're still building values. We're still, living according to a certain moral prescription. We're still deciding what ultimate reality means to us. And in the meantime, as days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months, months turn into years, we are living in a passive state of unbelief if we're agnostic. Let me press this point home more clearly. Agnosticism, out of all the ways you can believe, agnosticism sounds the most reasonable, but ultimately it's the only position that's 100% certain to be wrong, because in reality that question is decided. Either there is a God, like I believe, behind all of this, or there is no God. But what is certain is not there maybe is or maybe isn't. Reality is already decided. We just have to figure out what side we're on. And this brings us to my next point. I don't know how many of you have heard of this philosopher, but the mathematician Blaise Pascal has a famous line in his book Pensées, Pensée in French, and it's called Pascal's Wager. And the way it works is that if we believe in God and we're wrong, then we've probably sacrificed a few pleasures and a little bit of fun. But if we bet that God doesn't exist and we're wrong there, the consequences can be eternal. And when we look at this from like any sort of high stakes decision with risk versus reward, think about how we would treat that same type of choice in anything else, whether it's a medical screening or insurance, or wearing your seatbelt, retirement planning, eating right, staying away from high risk behaviors. You know, I personally am not really into skydiving. I've never done it. I never will. Not going to find me on a motorcycle. You know, I'm not very high risk that way. So I think many of you can relate to that kind of stuff. Now, maybe some of you can't, but the point is, many of us, if not most of us, have behaviors because of the risky nature of such. We'd rather not chance it. Yet millions, and I'm saying millions of people, chance it every day, their belief, their eternal destiny. And I think that you know, again, let's back up. Either way you want to go, just indifference, suspension of belief, that's maybe apparently the most reasonable, but once we examine it, it's probably the least rational response. So we've covered this, that, you know, theism, I think it takes faith, but I think it's reasonable. Atheism requires faith, I think, more. Agnosticism delays commitment, but reality itself is already decided. You know, just remember as you ponder your own belief or lack thereof that refusing to choose on this matter becomes a choice. Don't let the plane leave without you. That's all I have for this week. God bless. See you next week.